I'll start by saying that I am, or rather, I was, a very heavy sleeper. I've slept through storms, a car crashing into a building across the street from the house, you name it. Anyway, I was about 14 at the time and was living in the second story of the house with my pop. His room was across the hall from mine. In the days leading up to this, he hadn't looked well, but I brushed it off. He'd probably been working too hard again. It was about 12 at night, quite warm, so all the doors and windows were left open to let the breeze in. It was from a particularly deep sleep that I woke up with a really strange feeling. Something in my head kept telling me I needed to get up, but I ignored it and tried to get back to sleep. But then I heard it. It was this weird grunting or heavy breathing, and it scared the hell out of me. At first, I thought it was my neighbors coming home late and goofing off in the driveway. But their lights were off, and the noise continued. Finally, that feeling to get up became too much and I walked out towards my pop's room. He was asleep, at least I thought, and making these noises. He was a very light sleeper, so I was more than a little nervous when he wouldn't wake up. I moved closer, called louder, and still nothing. Finally, panic had set in, and I rushed downstairs to grab my nan, telling her I couldn't wake him up and he was making funny noises. As soon as she saw him, she told me to get the phone so she could call an ambulance. I was in tears for the rest of the night, thinking that this was how my pop would die. Turns out, he'd had a small stroke and was in the midst of it when I had found him. The doctor later told me if I hadn't have found him when I did, he would have died. His health wasn't fantastic after this, and 3 years later he passed away, but I always feel like that extra time wouldn't have happened if I had just kept sleeping. I was in high school and had a normal day like usual. I had to go to work after school and could not secure transportation, so I ended up walking about 2 miles to work. The second I stepped outside the house, I got this odd feeling. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and I couldn't figure out why. I remember going back in the house and checking to make sure that there wasn't anything wrong, and after going room by room, I decided against my hunch and proceeded to work. While walking to work through the neighborhood, I could hear one of these planes, and I looked for it, but could not find it. As I approached the highway, I saw yet another plane. This time I saw the plane and immediately my stomach clenched. The kind of clench that makes you sweat and the veins pop out in your neck. As I was walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen. Couldn't get the thoughts to stray from this, and for the life of me, I couldn't understand why. All night at work I had stomach issues and kept feeling that dread feeling. I tried to focus on work and nothing changed my mood or my thoughts. That night I was picked up by my mother and explained what was going on, and she hadn't a clue as to why I would be feeling bad. The saga continued into the morning, and after ingesting Imodium, my bowel issues ceased, but the dread didn't. I was sitting in the high school library when people started running to the TV. After it was over, the dread feeling was gone. The day was September 11th, 2001. One evening, while my husband was at work, I was giving our then 2-year-old son a bath. I heard a cough through the slightly open bathroom window. Normally, I wouldn't think much of it because the houses in this neighborhood were fairly close to each other. But for some reason I immediately felt scared and decided to go double check that the back door was locked. When I got to the door, there was some guy on the other side. We were basically face to face, and both of us reached for the doorknob at the same time. Luckily, I turned the lock before he was able to open it. I grabbed my cell and for some dumb reason called my husband instead of the police. He tells me to hang up and call 911, which I do. Meanwhile, the guy is pounding on the door trying to get in. Dispatchers stay on the phone with me and instruct me to go to the other end of the house. I was trying to be calm, so I didn't scare my son, but I heard breaking glass and a thud, and at that point started crying. After what seems like forever, I hear sirens. The dispatcher tells me to cover my son with a blanket so he can't see, and to run straight out the front door into a waiting police car. I open the door and I can see a police cruiser with the rear door open and an officer aiming a gun. Everything else is blurry. Once I was in the car, I see that there are actually quite a few police officers, all with guns drawn. Turns out they find him in the shed out back, with a backpack full of stolen items from other homes in the neighborhood. Apparently, the guy was a meth addict who had been awake for over a week. As I was signing the statement paperwork, an officer came in to say they found a machete at the back door. I still get shaken up when I think about that night. If I hadn't heard that cough, or if I had and thought nothing of it, if I didn't have the gut feeling that something was wrong, some machete-carrying meth head would have walked right into my house through an unlocked door. I don't even want to think about what might have happened. When I was a kid and my family lived in Hawaii, my parents had plans to hike Sacred Falls on Mother's Day. I was never a really big fan of hiking as a kid, so naturally I dreaded it, but my parents love hiking, so I was mentally preparing myself for a week. Nothing seemed off. However, my dad suddenly called it off and said he wanted to go to the mall instead, which is really weird for my dad to want instead of going into nature. This made me perk up a bit, so we spent the day at Pearl Ridge Mall instead. When we got home later that night, my dad received a call from his boss on base that seemed strange. The boss, who had known my dad had planned on hiking at Sacred Falls on Mother's Day, had said that he was extremely relieved to hear my dad's voice, which confused my dad. Turns out that a rock slide happened at Sacred Falls that day and killed 3 people. The boulders were as big as Volkswagen Beetles and caused multiple injuries. I remember my family and I just stood there in shock for a moment. I went to school the next day and found out that my friend had gone hiking that day with his soccer team. Not only did his father die from the rock slide, he fell into a coma after being hit by a rock. I only saw him in class one more time after that happened. His family immediately moved to his mother's home state after what had happened. It was really sad. This story happened to my sister a few years ago. She was in Northern California going on a hiking trip with her then boyfriend. They would often go camping, and this was just another one of those weekend trips. They got started late after work on Friday and were driving on the way to an area not often traveled, and it was night time. I don't believe they had even been to this area before. The road was very hilly as it was around mountain area, and they were driving up to higher elevation. Her boyfriend was driving and it was extremely foggy. So much so, it was hard to see just in front of them. With the road being so hilly, coupled with the fog, my sister said she wanted to stop and camp for the night. He didn't want to stop and just wanted to get to their planned destination. She felt adamant about stopping and said, "Stop this car right now, I don't feel safe." He continued to drive. She opened her car door and said, "I'm getting out right now if you don't stop." They were screaming at each other by now, and he finally reluctantly stopped the car, yelling about it the whole time. They set up camp for the night right off the side of the road. In the light of day, when they got up, they saw the road in front of them was completely missing. It was a complete drop-off, at least 50 feet or more. There were cars at the bottom all crunched up. If they had not stopped at that moment, they would have surely went off the cliff, as they couldn't see 2 feet in front of them due to the fog. When I was in high school, I had a group of friends that all lived near my dad's house, so I pretty much just hung out with them on the weekends. One Friday, one of my buddies called and asked if I was planning on hanging with them that night, and offered to come pick me up. I didn't have any other plans, but for some reason I just strongly did not want to go. No obvious reason, it was like I had just made up my mind not to go have fun, and there was nothing I could do to convince myself. So I turned him down and settled in for a night of watching crappy TV and feeling sorry for myself because everyone was out having fun. About 2 a.m. I was woken up by a boom, way off in the distance. It sent chills up my spine, but I just kept trying to convince myself I was hearing things, or some idiot was spotlighting close by. Then my stepmom calls me, frantic. The kids I hung out with had invited someone new to go out with them. They had climbed onto an oil well tank and were sitting around chatting, like we did all the time, no big deal. One of the wells was in use, the other was recently emptied and the workers hadn't sealed the top back. The new kid decided he wanted to see inside, took out a cigarette lighter for light, blew himself away, and it set off a chain reaction to the other. There were 5 kids there, only one survived, and that's because he was still climbing the ladder and got thrown sideways into a ditch instead. The other 4, it took a couple days to find all the body parts in the woods. If you enjoyed your time here, please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribe to FearLore. And don't forget to share your thoughts on the comments section below. Thank you for watching.